Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Pre-Accident Podcast. I am your loving, charming, and quite amazing host for today's 30 minutes of joy. Sit back in your chair. You're going to have a good time. Pretty good week this week. Lots of work, as always. But as I've always said, as the weather gets better, my attitude gets better. You know, I told you earlier I'm practicing gratitude. It's working, you guys. If you think of anything else on earth, think of this. We aren't good at being gracious, and we don't take enough time to show gratitude. So that was my whole goal this season, was to try to really be gracious and use gratitude in my life. And I think it's making a difference. I've been bumped up to first class 3 times in the last 3 flights. Tell me that's not worth its weight in gold. So today you're going to go on a little journey. Get ready. This is Ivan Pupilidy. And Ivan is a friend of mine from years ago. In fact, many people across these great United States have sat in the class that has been team taught by Todd and Pup. Often there were public arguments, discussions at quite high volumes, but it was always a really good class. And we had a great time. It was a treat to get to talk to Pup. And I want you to sort of take this journey on this podcast in sort of how the Forest Service, but really specifically how Pup started to develop his knowledge around Safety 2, the new view, the human performance look. Because remember, the journey to high reliability is a journey that starts with the basic understanding of human performance. So without much more fanfare, sit back, relax, unless you're on the jogging thing, and then don't do that. That would be weird. Don't crash your car. Listen carefully and enjoy Ivan. Pup, you can call him. Here's Pup.
And I have no idea where we're going. So,
do you care?
Yeah.
Where do you want to end? The question is where do you want to end?
I don't even know that.
You don't even know. So you have no idea where you're going.
And no idea where we're going to end.
So you could never be lost in this conversation. You'll never be lost in this conversation. So who are you? What are you? What's your name? Why are you here?
Ivan Pupilidy.
Yeah, no, that's good.
That's a good start. Right?
No, that part is good. That's really good, yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know how I really want to introduce myself for this, Todd.
Well, that's why I let you do it, because...
Yeah. So let's think about that for a second.
Okay.
I don't know if I want my Forest Service identity, you know what I mean? Let's go with it.
Yeah,
I mean, it is who I am right now, right?
Well, it's a big part of you.
Sure.
It's a huge part of you.
All right, so let's try that again.
So, okay, we're trying it already, so we're going already.
Oh, we're already going. We're on the road.
Yeah, it's happening. Good organizations identify things that are happening, not things that have happened. So you're in a good organization. So see, there it is.
There you go.
So just tell me your background. How did you find? Well, first of all, what job do you have now, and how did you find your way to that job?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Todd. So for me, the origin of this job started as I was losing 2.5 friends a year. That was our average loss in aviation in the Forest Service. And I'd have breakfast or lunch with these guys or dinner with these guys, and the next day they'd be gone. And every time I read a report about it, the first thing that I saw in the report was pilot error. And all of a sudden, these people went from really, really great people that I knew.
Right.
And I knew them as friends.
Right, sure, of course.
So all of a sudden, they were like faulty components in the system. They were bad and broken people because it was clearly their error that resulted in this terrible, terrible outcome. And I thought that just wasn't enough. It left me completely disquieted. There was a constant uneasiness about it, even though I'd been party to writing that kind of report.
Right.
And so it was really disturbing. So I started with a reach out to another university that'll remain nameless, but was in a very linear format that basically I could have cooperated and graduated and gotten a master's degree out of the program and been completely unhappy and been left with exactly the same answer.
What's the first thing you read? What made you even realize there was stuff out there to reach out to?
Oh, well, that's another really good question.
Well, I'm filled with these. Okay,
yes,
let's get that out.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
I don't know anything, but I have a lot of questions.
Well, I'm in the same boat as that. But at least when there are questions about me, I've got a couple answers.
Yeah, more than I do, for sure.
So I was actually assigned as a chief investigator to an accident, and it was a helicopter accident that occurred on the Klamath National Forest. And it would have been really easy to say pilot error. We had video at a time when not everybody had cell phones. We actually had video of this accident.
Right.
And the helicopter moves laterally and strikes a 250-foot sugar pine, destroys the rotor system, and the aircraft is destroyed and the pilot dies in the accident. And it would have been very, very, you could have done a drive-by investigation on this thing and just said pilot error. You've got the video, all the proof is there, all the evidence, as they like to say.
Exactly.
But I knew there had to be more to this. And the reason that I knew that there had to be more to this is because I could feel it in the people who had seen the incident. It was more of a feeling than it was anything else. We had a very prescriptive guide at the time called the Serious Accident Investigation Guide. And paragraph 2 of the Serious Accident Investigation Guide essentially says, if there was an accident and people were involved, it was a failure to follow policy and procedures. So we pretty much could have wrapped this thing up in about 5 minutes.
Bing, bang, boom.
Done.
It writes itself.
Exactly. Cut, paste, and you are done. But I had to kind of take a look at it differently because, again, I kept thinking this is not a flawed person. This is the kind of person with whom I would have had dinner the night before and all of a sudden was dead on the side of a hill. It had to be more than error. So we kind of looked at it and ended up doing essentially a technical report, but then simultaneously we started developing more social parameters around it. And I'm not talking about HVACs. I'm not talking about a process. I'm talking about discovery, asking questions, developing understanding. And we kind of fell into it naturally. And I had my dear friend Naj Mishkati. He was up there as a technical advisor.
How'd you know Naj?
So I knew Naj from the safety school.
Because, no one knows Naj. You're his dear friend. He will hug you. I mean, he's just the best guy in the whole world. He makes me happy just hearing his name said.
Yes. And he gives you that same feeling when you talk to him.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if you can succeed in making Naj angry, you've really accomplished
I can't
something.
even imagine. Oh, my God, you must be an evil person. Oh.
So I've known Naj for years. I actually met him while I was in the Coast Guard. I was sent to the USC program, the safety program.
Sure.
And Naj was teaching the human factors course there. And I was absolutely enamored with him. And he and I remained in correspondence for quite some time. And when I had the opportunity to work with him, I jumped on it and brought him up as the technical advisor, essentially, on this accident. And as we started to pour through it, we started to see things that we could apply from Jim Reason, in terms of latent conditions. And we looked at that, and we understood a little bit more, I think, about what James Reason was trying to say with regard to conditions. This early work that he did on conditions in the human error book.
Kind of the beginning stuff, right?
Yeah.
This is even pre-Swiss cheesy kind of stuff.
Very much pre-Swiss cheesy, because, I mean, you could argue that the whole concept that he was outlining in human error gets hijacked by the Swiss cheese concept.
I actually think he would argue that. I mean, I think it would be kind of a flat argument. The only people that still believe the Swiss cheese model is really a valid frame for the world are practitioners in the field using the Swiss cheese model. And to be fair, Pup, and I think this should be said, I think the Swiss cheese model did a lot of heavy lifting.
I agree. I think it paved a road.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it knocked down a lot of barriers, and it started us on a journey of inquiry, really, because we started to ask questions. I mean, Rasmussen kind of kicks us into the park,
the
and gets us going a little bit here, quite a bit. But Reason starts to bring it together in a way that people can start to understand it. He starts to make it accessible. And I think that is a tremendous gift, and we've got to pay homage to that gift.
I agree. Yeah. So
I'm working with Naj on this accident investigation, and it's going a little bit longer than the Forest Service would like, but we're doing it to the best of our ability. And every time we start to think we're close to being done, we uncover something else. And I always think back on something that you said: you'll never know more about an accident than the day you stop looking into it.
Exactly, I agree completely.
Yeah, and so this was a big deal for us, and we did have to finally find a stop rule to it, to stop looking into it. But it was based on diminishing return. Is probably the biggest lesson that we got out of it.
So I think of investigations as an S curve. There's nothing at first, then there's a ton of stuff, and then there's kind of a diminishment of the information, and it kind of levels out. That's what I always think of. When you feel like you're at a point where you're not learning anything anymore, maybe you're done.
Yeah, maybe you are. Yeah, and I think that's exactly where we were with this. And anyway, so I'm in Naj's office, and we're kind of writing up the report, and we're thinking about different quotes that we can enter into it. And I see this book in the corner of his office. And if you've ever been to Naj's old office, It was interesting.
Okay, that's enough. Yeah, I got it. I understand.
And in the corner of the office is this book, and the book is the Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. And Naj, in his beautiful Persian accent, says, "Oh, my friend Ivan, if you take book, you read book, you tell me what it's about, you can have book." So I took the book and hopped in a taxi cab from USC, drove to the airport in Los Angeles, flew back to Denver and back to my house in another taxi cab. And by the time I'd reached my house, I had read the book.
This is the little red and black one.
Yes.
The version 1.
Yes.
Which is, I guess, I have 2 copies. I'm not bragging. That is a little bit braggy, though. But I guess you can't even find this one anymore. That was the first toe dip I had into that as well. And it read like a comic book, and it read in hours. It was a brilliant book.
It was amazing.
Yeah, I agree.
It laid out so many of the frustrations that I felt during this investigation, because here I am stuck with this linear process in a very nonlinear world.
Yeah.
Now, why? The idea of saying linear, we've adopted that into our vocabulary of late, but really, what it was having a model that was procedural and checklist-like,
right.
And that's what I mean by linear,
right, yeah.
And having something on the other side that was completely fluid, just moving and tumultuous and not showing signs of linearity. We could create that, but not showing those signs of linearity. Things seem to be coming together almost randomly, but not quite randomly. And so this was something that we had to kind of juggle with, because you can get really easily seduced into the linear model. You can start to believe it because you can start seeing pieces of it that perform in certain ways. So, for example, when I started this, I started telling you about the technical report, which I actually called the destruction sequence, which the NTSB was very happy with. They liked the destruction sequence. It gave them a clear beginning, middle, and an end.
Right.
And they liked that. And it has a linearity that's associated with it.
Sure, and it's a machine, so a machine breaks in a linear way.
Exactly. But what we didn't see is we didn't see other components of the system breaking. Nothing else was breaking. We had a failure, obviously. I mean, you could call it that because we had a fatality at the end of this thing and there was a crash. But what we also had was we had a lot of people that were doing what Holdnagel likes to call the dynamic non-event.
Right.
And it was happening consistently until the event happened. In fact, what happened with this particular story is the helicopter came in the day before and did exactly the same mission. And people on the ground saw it and thought, this is really dangerous. 2 of them ran back into the woods to get away from the scene where this helicopter was coming in, dropping off blivets of water. Others just kind of looked and thought, wow, this is really interesting. Maybe we should bring a camera up here tomorrow and video it, because they were going to come up the next day and the pilot was going to come up the next day and do the same mission. And so the pilot comes up next day, does the same mission, no wind, no weather issues whatsoever. In fact, the fire is in mop-up, so there's no emergent nature to this mission at all.
So really no production pressure? I mean...
None of that. And so what we end up seeing is the pilot come in and then move laterally, and we've got to try and... We have a choice. We can explain why that happened, which I would offer that there is really no way to truly explain it. Or we could begin to understand what the dynamics of the situation were that allowed it to happen.
Right.
And this was our first foray into that. It was our first foray into that. And then having Decker's book on top of that, with the key word being understanding, things started falling into place. A year later, I find myself on the same forest with another fatality, and this is a ground incident. Solely ground, no aircraft involvement. And I'm not a ground firefighter. I'm an aviation firefighter with an aviation background and a background in aviation accident investigation. Well, here's the good news. That allowed me to ask some really stupid questions.
Exactly. Not knowing is good.
Not knowing is actually fantastic, because being in that situation, I could rely on the subject matter experts who very frankly looked at me a couple of times like, why are you doing this? And how did you get to be chief investigator? I mean, this is really basic. But when we asked those basic questions, sometimes the answers that were evoked showed some interesting assumptions that were being made about the way the world works. And as we started to think about those assumptions, what we started to realize is that we weren't in a cause-effect relationship anymore. We were instead in an atmosphere of influence where the conditions weren't causing things to happen. They were influencing things to happen. They were influencing decisions.
So how do you respond to that? Because now that's very comfortable. We can talk about this a lot. But this is years ago,
yes,
when that language wasn't even... I mean, I remember being in investigations where they would say, we're not allowed to write things like that.
Yeah.
Right? There's no space in the form for that. What'd you do? How'd you handle it?
So I was really lucky. After the first accident, the year before with the helicopter, I had already created a space in leadership, and they wanted more of this. They wanted more of an expansive view of these kinds of incidents. And they didn't use the word learning at that point. They still didn't. We hadn't progressed to that level, but I could interject new language into the argument, and they were ready for that. And what we did decide to do is this concept of understanding, and substituting cause, removing cause from the description altogether.
Ooh, that's dangerous.
Oh, and it worked.
Oh, yeah, it totally works,
Yeah.
but it's so scary for these guys.
And I was really surprised by it too, because it was a kind of an interesting story. It was a June day in Washington D.C., 100 and gosh knows how many degrees and 98% humidity, and you've always got to go in the tie and the
Yeah. It's DC, but especially in the old days. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I was drenched by the time we sat down, and the head of business operations are the person to whom we have to present these reports was a guy by the name of Hank Cashton, and Hank came into the office late, into the meeting late. I'm sweating. The guy's sitting next to me who's the team leader. I'm the chief investigator, and he's saying, "Don't worry, don't worry, don't worry." Well, I'm worried. Okay, I'm really worried because I haven't used the word cause. I haven't used the word blame. I haven't put in findings. And I have recommendations that I've actually started to vet through the community. And Hank Cashton comes in, flurry of activity. He hangs his coat up on the coat rack, and he sits down and he picks up the report and kind of throws it on the desk. And I go, I'm done.
It's done, yeah.
Back to the drawing board.
They're not ready. They are not ready.
And Hank looks at me and he goes, when I picked this report up, I expected to see the same old, same old. I was so pleased. I want more of this.
Ah, nice.
And that was it.
That's all you need, right? I mean, because
it.
then you've got legitimacy in the agency, and the story, the report, the corrective actions kind of write themselves. I mean, you're right on target.
Exactly. And we used Decker very heavily in that. In fact, the briefing to the team was from Field Guide to Understanding. So I exert on the way over. I'm getting flown over there in a Forest Service aircraft, and I'm flipping through Decker, just reading, and they dump me in this little airport in the middle of nowhere, Wairika, California, and they come and pick me up in a car, and I'm still reading Decker, and I've done some margin notes of how I'm going to do the briefing for the team, and we get the in-brief from the forest, and then I have to stand up and brief the team on how this thing's going to go. And I take the Serious Accident Investigation Guide, the hard copy that I've got with me, and I take it and I throw it in the trash. Very demonstratively. And I said, this is not what we're doing, and here's what we're doing. And I use these bullet points that I pulled out of Field Guide from Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. And it really resonated with the team, because here we have a ground firefighter who's been burned to death in a tragic accident.
Sure.
And these guys can actually see themselves in that place.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And so for them, there was a palpable sense of relief in them that we're not going to go after this guy and do what we've done in the past. The other thing that was really different about this particular incident is that the family asked to meet the investigation team.
Really?
And, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was if I said it was a traumatic moment, that would be an understatement.
It's more of a solemn duty kind of moment, isn't it? I mean,
that's what it's become.
Yeah. I mean,
but remember, trained as a linear aircraft
new
accident.
language. Yeah.
This is all secret
ideas,
stuff. Nobody can walk in the special room. You've got all this pomp and ceremony. Well, all that pomp and ceremony melted away, and what we were left with was a story.
Right.
And what we were left with was trying to make sense of that story. So from understanding now to sense making, and it becomes a bridge through this. And the way we went about doing it was we actually identified some key decisions and actions, and we started with sticky notes, just Post-it notes, putting conditions on sticky notes, and we started plopping them up on this wooden veneer wall. And by the time we were done, we had this mosaic of conditions that surrounded these decisions and actions, and we could start to see relationships and interdependencies between the conditions, not just around the actions, but now this network of influence that was surrounding these actions and decisions. And it became the foundation of what later became the dissertation that I just completed.
Yeah, which we want to chat about that. I think maybe we want to hold that for its own podcast.
Sure.
Because I'd really like to dig deeper into this investigation protocol that you're developing. I want to, though, take you back. So you introduce new ideas, new language, very different, very, very non-linear thinking. You come up with an understanding of how events happen. what do you have to do to bring leadership along on this ride? Because you lucked out. I'm just going to say it. This Hank guy, because he had realized at some point on his own journey that our old system was not sufficient enough, you lucked out when Hank said, this is exactly, and I have a story very similar to that as well in my history. How did you bring leadership along? What did you guys do in the Forest Service?
Well, you were actually part of this story. So we
that is how we met.
Yeah,
so we should
we should do this. Well, we actually met through Sydney.
It is true.
Right? Sydney said, you got to call this guy Todd on the phone, and I said, sure, I'll call this guy Todd, and the rest is kind of history. But the way that
love at first phone call,
it was pretty much. And then, well, anyway, we'll kind of get into that later too, probably. But just going back to your first question, the idea of how we created the space within leadership. There was a very forward-thinking guy in the Forest Service who started a research, development, and application group, and it was called Risk Management and Human Factors, RDNA, Research, Development, and Application.
Gotcha.
His name's Jim Saveland.
Gotcha.
And Jim was really forward-thinking in concepts like mindfulness, high-reliability organizing, resilience thinking,
right,
and dynamics of dialogue. And he went around the country and he found a program that is actually headquartered up in the Massachusetts area. Bill Isaacs is the guy who invented it, basically, and it was called Leadership for the Collective Intelligence. And the company that Bill has is called Dialogos. And what Jim did was he went to Dialogos, to their Leadership for the Collective Intelligence program, went all the way through it, and came back to leadership and said, you've got to go on this thing. This is a really good thing for leadership. It's really mind expanding. You really need to go and see what this is like. So selected members of our highest level of leadership started going to this thing. And during this process, they became in tune with the concepts, really the same concepts that Sydney talks about in Field Guide to Understanding.
Got you.
That created a lot of space for it. The next thing that happened was Dialogos came down and did a diagnostic memo for the Forest Service on how leadership was functioning. And it was pretty interesting. Leadership got a pretty good mirror view, and I don't think they liked what they saw.
Sure.
But that also poised them to start asking questions. And that at that inquiry, they began to create space themselves. And they asked for a safety journey. Thus enters Todd. The very first place we go for the safety journey is to Los Alamos.
I didn't know that.
Yep.
So we were the first visit.
You were
really?
the first visit. Yep, you were.
How funny.
And if you remember the dynamic conversations that you engaged those guys in, and how they felt, and you could see a transformation occurring just in the few hours that you were able to spend with them in that 1 minute.
Yeah, and I didn't know who they were. So I knew they were from the Forest Service, but I didn't realize they were mucky mucks.
Oh,
because they didn't really
mucks.
act mucky. I mean, they were pretty attainable, and I remember teasing one of the guys pretty mercilessly in class.
Kent Connaughton.
In fact, I call him Dr. Smarty Pants.
Yes, the idiot savant.
Yeah, the idiot savant. I remember that. But I remember that journey was really, because they were very open, and they were there to learn, and so they postured themselves in a way where learning was doable, I guess.
Well, those 6 guys were very, very high in our system. They were regional foresters. And when they came out, they went back to the National Leadership Council, and they again reinforced what Hank had said, which is, we want more of this. And so the second visit was actually to the Coast Guard, to the Coast Guard Safety Organization.
Right.
And then we went to UPS. We went to Con Edison. We took them to a whole bunch of different places where safety is done in a lot of different ways so that they could see it. And certain members glommed onto the things that you'd expect them to glom onto, the compliance aspects of it, and how can we get more accountability, standard definition accountability. Right. But others started seeing a different definition of accountability, or at least asking what else is important about accountability beyond this.
You're famous for your definition of accountability.
Oh, I am?
You know that?
I did not know that.
Decker quotes you all the time.
Really?
Yeah.
How fascinating.
Define accountability for us.
Is this my cross?
No.
We are accountable to learn?
Forward-looking, backward-looking.
Oh. Okay.
This happens to me all the time. Remember that time you said this thing?
Yeah, remember that time you said this thing? Well, remind me, Todd. Tell me about my forward-looking, backward-looking.
Do you define accountability as a forward-looking value, or do you use it as a backwards-looking
Yes, exactly.
value.
Yeah, and actually we've expanded on that definition. So you're absolutely right. So our initial foray into redefining accountability, and by the way, what we're really finding is we're redefining a lot of things. We're redefining risk. We're redefining safety.
So what is your new definition of risk?
Well, I'll tell you. It started with the concept of forward-looking and backward-looking, where we had been backward-looking, and what we needed to do was look forward into accountability. And actually that came from Sidney's course in a question that he asked about accountability. And then I had to really think about it for the first time, and that kind of emerged. But where we are now is we kind of think about traditional accountability in terms of hierarchical. I'm going to come down and hold you accountable. And usually the resultant of that is that, wait a minute, there's some accountability in this that resides in you, and we get kind of a finger pointing thing, up and down finger pointing. The other thing we want to kind of understand is what were the values of what I call the horizontal axis of accountability, which is peer accountability and self-accountability. So with peer accountability, I want to know how that's functioning. How are peers holding each other accountable in the system? Or how are they acting toward one another in terms of accountability? And then on the other side, what is self-accountability? How are people self-accountable? And I can tell you this. Every single investigation that I've gone to, you couldn't possibly hold our people more accountable than they hold themselves.
Oh, I find that too. I find the very same. In fact, it's touching to me and almost tragic that we pretend to think people aren't accountable because a failure happened, when in fact they're just beating the crap out of themselves.
Exactly. Turning themselves inside out.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Self-loathing, self-blame, admonishment.
Had I only... Would I only have? Yeah.
Exactly. And we get all, like you said, we get right into that counterfactual language, and people are, if I just turned right. And the thing about that that's really important to understand is the humanity of it. And that here people are being truly vulnerable. They're opening themselves up to vulnerability. And as we start to see that, we start to honor it.
Right.
It's more than just honoring their perspective at that point, because this particular perspective, you could argue that it has no value to blame yourself for an accident. I don't think it does.
Oh, no, none at all.
And it has even less value if the organization's doing the blaming.
Yeah, I agree. Blame is a complete red herring.
Exactly.
It moves energy and thinking and logic in the wrong direction. It's a complete waste of time. I agree with you completely.
And so what I discovered was that this vulnerability ended up being the exact opposite of shame. These people were standing up and being strong in this moment in telling their story. So it started out with this self-loathing, self-hate, self-admonishment, but very quickly, if you ask a question like, tell me what happened, it changes, it transforms into them telling their story with it in mind that this telling is going to make the world better. It's going to keep this from happening again.
I wonder how many investigators think of the process of actually asking a worker or coworker to tell the story of what happened as a moment of vulnerability. Because we treat it like an interrogation. You are a criminal. Tell us what you know. Tell just the facts. The facts.
It's one thing that we had to move away from very, very quickly.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, the first time you look into somebody's eyes and you listen to their story and you hear it for what it is, it doesn't matter if it's minutes after the event or weeks after the event.
Yeah, I agree.
It doesn't matter if it changed.
I agree completely.
None of that matters. What really matters is how these people are starting to make sense of the situation for themselves. And then you start to recognize that the important part of the process is to help them to make sense of it.
And to help them restore.
Yes.
So this notion of restorative investigation, because our job is really to restore the facility, restore the organization, restore the team back to where they can function again.
And a lot of that is restoring their dignity.
Absolutely. I agree completely.
Yeah. I think that you're right. I don't know if I'd use the word restore necessarily, because the sense that I get about restoring is to come back to a place where we once were. I don't know that that's possible. I like to think of it more as facilitating their sense making and their understanding. And so when I'm doing this, I'm thinking about the community of practice and how they're going to make sense of it. Because believe me, I've written my fair share of really crappy investigations. Right?
Yes, we all have.
Yeah, and
I never want to go back and look.
No, I never do. Well, but every time I do, it's shocking. I really wrote that? Oh my goodness. I mean, where you walk out and you have the answers. That's when you should think that you're off. You're in the wrong place.
And you write
completely.
these horrible worker failed to identify the risk apparent in this operation. Classically, the worker was not it's
terrible.
Like, what did we do?
It's terrible. And it has nothing to do with accountability. No, absolutely nothing. In fact, the 4 axes that I was talking about, what we've all agreed to now with our new process is that we are now going to hold ourselves accountable to learn from the event. And that's our forward-looking accountability. And that's organizational and individual. So as a result, we now don't create a single product. We now create 2 learning products at least, one for the field and one for leadership. It's a very different approach.
Let's pull the string on that. But let's do it next time. Can you come back in a couple weeks?
Yeah, sure. You bet.
You don't mind?
No, I don't mind.
So did we cover enough today?
Yeah, I think so.
What do you think?
Yeah.
Was it terrible?
No, it's never terrible. Talking to you, Todd, it's never terrible. You're
this
kidding?
Was super fun. Well, as long as we covered everything, then that's good. That's what we wanted to do. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. Just hearing you talk about this has revitalized me to stay the course for this new view to investigate. We got to change this. If we do nothing else, we've got to change this. Thanks for your time, pup.
Thank you, Todd.
Later, Chater. Wow. What'd you think? Did it blow your mind a little? I got to tell you guys, let's take just a moment. Take a breath. Ready? Deep breath. That whole part where he talks about talking to the workers, the co-workers, the people who were involved in the accident, I think there's something there for us. I really would challenge you to think about the fact that those people are coming to this story in an open and honest position. They're incredibly vulnerable. Our job is to understand that vulnerability and to create a space where they can talk about the conditions that exist that drove the actions. It's really important. I can't wait to talk to Pup again. And we will, because I want to talk to him about a couple things. So stay tuned. Pup will reappear on this podcast to talk specifically about a relatively new accident investigation theory he's working on. And then I want to get him to talk more about risk, because I think I screwed that up because I interrupted him. Until then, thank you for listening. It means a lot to me. It was really good. Please subscribe, because for some reason that makes some huge difference to everybody. And at least that's what everybody asks me all the time. How many people subscribe? Well, I don't know. I don't even know how to find it out. Until then, have fun every day. Learn something new. And for goodness sakes, be safe.